video covers Native Americans. I also call them Indians because it's just shorter to get it out that fast. I love the Canadian term. They don't use Native Americans, they use First Nations. And that may be because the population of Native Americans in Canada, depending on the province, can be anything from 5 to 80%. In America, it's a very small percentage of the population. Today, something under 2%, 1.5%, something like that. Okay, so we are starting with that first file that says South and West, and starting with slide number 15, which is the text. From the very beginning, the settlement of America, there have been issues with Native Americans. We discussed the South, not talking much about the South again for another 75 years. Why? Because as we said, nothing changes. The West is an interesting concept in American history. It is a place, but it is also an idea and a way of life. This is part of what made Americans the way they are. We had a large area, half a continent to settle, a continent to start out with, and we had to invent, to adapt, and stand on our own a lot of the time. And that's where this strong strain of individualism comes from in America that is not so prominent in most European countries. What we are defining the West as west of the 100th meridian. West of, more or less, a little bit west of the Mississippi River. These Native Americans had no traditional agriculture by and large, except for some of the tribes in Arizona and northern New Mexico. There's a lot of myth. The reality usually is often very different than what the myth is. We like to think of the myth. Estimated 1492, there were approximately 20 million Native Americans west of the Mississippi River. Today, there are, by the time, there were maybe 20 million before Columbus. There were 250,000 right at the beginning of the Civil War. By 1900, that number was down to 25,000. And today, there is something like a little bit over 5 million, and how we define Indian is another question, who claim to be Native American, or at least largely Native American, and that is less than 2% of the population. There were 500 tribes and 500 different languages north of Mexico in 1492. But everything changes with the Columbian Exchange, as we've talked about. What Europeans bring change not only their own society, but Native American societies. And we talked about the introduction of horses. The horses made the Plains Indian that we see today in the movies with the headdresses, the bison hunters. Hunting bison on foot is a whole lot different than hunting on horseback. From the beginning, there were issues with Europeans from 1492. First of all, most Native American tribes were polytheistic. They worshipped many gods as opposed to a single Christian god. Most Native American tribes, not all, but most, were at least partly or strongly matrilineal. That means descent through the mother, not through the father. This is very different than in Europe, where we still take our father's names by and large. In Native American societies, almost all of them, when a man married, he moved to his wife's family. And his children were raised by their mother, by his wife, and usually the mother's brothers. The father did not have a prominent role. It was the mother's brothers in most cases. A lot of property was owned by women in Native American tribes, and land often. And on the East Coast and in many Western tribes as well, the leaders and the spokesmen for the tribes were selected by groups of the older matrons, the older women in the tribe. So they had a very strong role, although they were not hunters and warriors. The main difference was this idea of consensus and the community. What was important in Native society, of course, was that the community survived, that the tribe survived. You as an individual were not anywhere near as important as the group as a whole. So, for example, anybody who was a prominent person in the tribe or even a good hunter was obligated and never even questioned the concept of sharing whatever he brought home with people who were less fortunate. For example, older people who had no one to support them, or someone who was injured until he got on his feet again. The main thing was that the group continue. You can see this today in, for example, Japanese society is known for consensus. How do Japanese reach an agreement in business? They sit around, they hash out the issue, and they keep talking until there is general agreement on some principle. This is exactly what Native Americans did. It's not surprising that Japanese and a number of Asian societies had no issues with wearing masks when coronavirus hit, because their goal is group oriented. They also are much more conducive to taking directions from other people. Americans are not. We are not group oriented, we are individual oriented. And part of that, I think, comes from the frontier, where you were largely on your own and had to depend on yourself and maybe a few neighbors for a long time. Okay. Slides 16 and 17 deal with some of the reasons for decline. So you had 250,000 in 1865. 30 years later, there are 25,000. So what wiped out all of these Native Americans, 220,000 of them, in just basically a generation? Number one is something I talked about at length with the Columbian Exchange. With the introduction of Europeans, also came European diseases to which Native Americans had no resistance to, or very little resistance to. Why is this? I go in detail in the first half of the class. They had no immunity to European diseases. Europeans died too, but nowhere near at the rate of Native Americans. And this is a number that's worth remembering: 90% death rate. That is statistically true. Tribes, 90% death rate, oftentimes before they even saw a European, because the disease would travel from tribe to tribe as people moved around. Still today, this is true. Native Americans living on reservations today still have higher death rates from things that we don't consider serious illnesses, even when they're inoculated. Things like measles, whooping cough, flu, that kind of stuff. They do not have the generations and generations in the millennium of immunity, and that is still true. Lots of stories of the Navajo Reservation, traders on the Navajo Reservation, early 1900s, and there would be epidemics of things like the flu and measles, which are not huge killers in our society. Even when they were inoculated, they still died in large numbers because they had no long-term hereditary immunity. So if you look at the destruction of Native American tribes, 90% death rate, that explains a lot there. The second reason is their main food source on the plains and in other places, the bison and the slaughter of the bison. And you can see that pillar of skulls in the next slide there. Estimated 1870, there were still something like 25 to 30 million bison. Before Columbus, tens of millions of bison. 30 years later, 20 years later, there are almost none. We almost wiped out the species. Early travelers west of the Mississippi talk about sitting on a hill and watching herds travel for 48 hours underneath them. There would be bison in the same herd moving for 48 hours. They talked about herds being 50 miles long. How were they slaughtered? The railway did not help. It not only gave easy access, people would shoot from trains, of course, but it also cut their migration patterns. Bison did not like the railway tracks, often would not cross them, and definitely didn't like the trains at all, and would not migrate where they should have to get south away from the hard winter storms. There were professional bison hunters, hide hunters they were called, because the only things they took from the carcass, and a bison, depending on male or female, is about 1,000-pound animal. It is more or less like a horse, only a different shape. They only took the hides and the tongues. Once you eliminate the bison, and the U.S. Army encouraged the hide hunters, they knew that the Native Americans had nothing to depend on, because we all learned this in fourth grade. From the bison, they got their shelter, their houses, their food, their tools, their clothing, etc., etc. You wipe out the bison, they pretty much have to come on reservations or starve, one or the other. Other things that changed and helped wiped out Native Americans, the technology has changed. Up to the end of the Civil War, really Native Americans can at least hold their own, if not have an advantage in technology. Because up until the end of the Civil War, most weapons, most guns had one single shot, and it took about 60 seconds to reload. So in 60 seconds, most Native Americans on the plains could get off 6 to 7 arrows on the back of a running horse with pretty darn good accuracy. So by the time you've reloaded your weapon, the guy is on top of you and you're probably dead. Civil War created all kinds of new technology. It created repeating rifles. The Henry rifle had 16 shots. Spencer carbine had 20 rounds that it could shoot. And then, of course, the Gatling gun was perfected, which shot up to 60 or 70 shots. In other words, an early version of a machine gun. They also shot at much further distances. The guns that the buffalo hide hunters used were single shot. They had a very large caliber bullet and could often kill the bison with a single shot, and they could kill a bison over 1,000 yards. That is close to 3/4 of a mile. That's a long, long ways. Check your odometer the next time you're in the car. A Colt pistol, which most of the military carried, could shoot pretty accurately at 300 feet. So once you get repeating rifles and long-range rifles, there's no way Native Americans can compete with that technology. And they were systematically used by the U.S. military and by civilians and militias. The other reason that they have issues is warfare. Slides 18 to 21 deal with the Indian Wars. Unlike many of the eastern tribes west of the Mississippi, many of the tribes were fairly aggressive. They fought for their land. What choice did they have, really? Once their lands were invaded, they fought to repel Anglo-Americans and to hang on to what they had. Not all. Some tribes cooperated, particularly with the military. The Crow and Shoshone were famous for working as scouts with the U.S. Army. Not surprisingly, those two tribes survived pretty well without the same death rates. But most fought whenever they were challenged and usually lost in the long run. One of the few really successful battles and successful campaigns was, of course, the Little Bighorn. And we all know what happened to Custer at the Little Bighorn. He was, as they say, rubbed out, 1876. Why? Why did Custer go down into that valley? He was told by his own Indian scouts there are thousands of Sioux and Cheyenne warriors down there. And he went anyway. He had a grand total of 265 men with him. There were approximately 8,000 United Sioux and Cheyenne in the valley of the Little Bighorn. Why did Custer do this? There's a lot of issues with Custer. He did have an alcohol problem. He certainly had an ego problem. He was thinking about running for president in the next presidential election. He needed a huge victory so that he would get in the national news and everybody would recognize his name. And he thought the Little Bighorn was a good opportunity for it. Also interesting, Custer graduated last in his class at West Point. He did fight in the Civil War. Not necessarily a good military officer. And he certainly has an ego that he needs to deal with. Went down there, got slaughtered to the man. The only survivor was one of the cavalry horses, at the end of that battle. How come the Indians were successful in this battle and usually not successful? For one thing, the numbers. They united. It was one of the few times that Native American tribes united against Anglos. When they did, they were often more successful. But remember, these are small groups, different tribes that are constantly at war and raiding each other. So the impulse was, I'm not going to deal with the Cheyenne. They're our hereditary enemies. Towards the end, they realized we had better unite to fight the Anglos, but by then it was becoming too late. When they did, they were usually successful. The portrait there is of the Nez Perce chief, Chief Joseph. The book doesn't talk about him. I think he's really one of the most interesting people at the time. His tribe was told, get on the reservation. They refused. Some of them went. Chief Joseph refused. And he led a group of 800, mainly women and children. 2/3 were women and children. He did not have more than 150 warriors with him. And they tried to escape from U.S. territory to get to Canada because he knew if he got to Canada, the U.S. Army could not pursue him. So they spent something like 9 months covering 1,300 miles through the roughest part of the Rocky Mountains in Idaho and Montana, and eluded the entire U.S. Army that was after him. Again, remember, they are 2/3 women and children. They were finally caught, and he surrendered, and they did go back to a reservation. He was caught only 50 miles from Canada. If they had made it another 50 miles, they would have not been sent back to the reservation. The Comanche in Texas, at the end, had only 1,000 warriors. The U.S. Army went after them. The ones that left the reservation, the Comanche, had only 1,000 that refused to go on the reservation. Of those 1,000, only 300 were warriors of any age. And 3,000 American troops chased them as well for over a year before they finally gave up and came on the reservation. So the Indian Wars dragged on forever. Geronimo, the last successful Indian War, really doesn't end until the late 1880s. Again, he has a few women and children, very few warriors, and for 5 months, the U.S. Army, throwing thousands of troops and trying to block him, could not catch him. The last slides, couple of slides there, are the ghost dance. And this is kind of a last-ditch psychological effort by Native Americans. It starts about in the 1890s. And this was a movement that had occurred already early in the 1800s, the same kind of movement among Native Americans in the Ohio Valley. This was another Indian prophet. He was a Paiute from Utah, and he traveled among the tribes, and he was preaching that if Native Americans gave up Anglo ways, started dressing in Indian clothing, gave up alcohol, gave up the guns, went back to traditional ways and traditional hunting, and they also had to do this special dance and special songs that he taught them, then all of the whites would disappear, the bison would come back, their ancestors would come back, and everybody would live happily ever after. He instructed them to make special shirts with special symbols, which he told them would deflect Anglo bullets, the bullets from Anglo guns, and would keep them safe because he had special powers. Didn't work out quite that way at all. They found out very quickly that they had no special powers. They danced and they sang because they were desperate, often starving on the reservations. They were issued government rations, government food, but between Washington and what arrived at the reservation, there was a lot of fraud. There was a lot of people skimming off the top of government Indian rations, and they usually did not get what they were promised. So a lot of reservations are on the verge of starvation in the late 1800s. The ghost dance was powerfully appealing. Lots of Indians danced and sang. The Anglo communities around them, the whites around them, got a little bit worried about this. What's going on there? They thought there would be an uprising. Many of the Indian agents were really seriously worried about this. They sent word back to Washington. Troops turn out. of course, to protect the white settlers, and the upshot of the whole thing is Wounded Knee, which is probably one of the most atrocious Native American massacres in history. It is not the U.S. Army. It is a militia, which is a civilian group, civilian military, not the U.S. Army. It was a state militia, and they found a group of Sioux that were coming back to their reservation. They camped about 2 days away from the reservation. The chief had a white flag above his tent. He was ill. He was basically crippled, limping on one leg. Mainly women and children, something like between 250 and 300 people in the group. They were headed back to the reservation. The militia found them, set up a machine gun, and attacked the camp the next morning. They did walk in and say, "Surrender all the guns." Don't know exactly what happened. Clearly, not all the Indians had turned in all their guns. A shot was fired by one of the Indians, and the militia, the Anglo militia, basically opened fire, machine gun down on the spot, over 200 men, women, and children. Many of the women and children, the men stayed to try and hold back the militia. Many of the women and children tried to flee. This was in December. There was several feet of snow on the ground. As they ran, they were gunned down by the Americans where they stood. And when people went to pick up the bodies later, they found basically a trail of bodies leading for over a mile down a little ravine where people had desperately tried to escape. That is considered the last Native American fight, if you want to call that. It truly was a massacre. But in 1890, that is the end of armed resistance, and that's the last event. Okay, there is a couple of slides there of reservations before and after, which is really interesting to look at. Government policy, which is slide number 22. The intent of the U.S. government from the beginning was never to eliminate Native Americans. Even George Washington and Thomas Jefferson were very sympathetic to Native American rights, to Native American cultures. On the other hand, they thought quite clearly they're going to die out, so the problem's going to disappear anyway. The goal was to put Indians, to preserve Indians. And for a long time, the policy was reservations. Areas were reserved basically for Native Americans. The first legal restriction was 1834. I don't care about the dates or technically the names. The Indian Intercourse Act, which does not mean sex with Indians, it means no encounters with Indians, no intercourse, no communication with Indians. These created reservations east of the Mississippi that were supposed to be held by Native Americans forever. Of course, that didn't work out. And they were gradually pushed west. 1851, a reservation was created in what is now Oklahoma, and tribes were moved out under the orders of Andrew Jackson so that Anglos could claim the land. The Dakotas were also given to the Sioux forever, supposedly. The problem, of course, with reservations is that west of the Mississippi, most Indians are nomadic. They follow the herds, and that doesn't work. You cannot keep them on the reservation as long as they are surviving off of bison and hunting animals. Unfortunately, gold is discovered in the Black Hills in the Dakotas in 1874, and when gold is discovered, Indians and whites both knew the whole thing is over because the area becomes flooded with Anglos, and there's constant skirmishing. That's where Custer came in, trying to push back Native Americans and protect the gold miners. So reservations worked dismally. They turned in 1887 to a new policy of assimilation. The Dawes Act, the Severalty Act, basically was to carve up reservations and give a certain amount of land to individual Indian families. They were allotments, they were called. So 80 acres were given to an adult, 40 acres for each kid. So the average family could have about 300 acres or so. Now, this is very convenient because any surplus land on the reservation would be taken and opened for white settlement, and whites could buy it. So if you look at those two maps, you can see what happened. Indians were allocated, given their land, and then the rest was sold to whites. 90 million was given or was eventually sold to Anglos. 48 million stayed in Native American hands. And the reservations got a lot smaller. You can see it visually on the map. Another part of assimilation was to take Native American children and send them to boarding schools a long way away, usually from their reservations. Sometimes there were schools on the reservations, oftentimes there were not. And this policy continued into really fairly recently. When I worked on the Navajo Reservation in the 1970s, we still had a boarding school for kids as young as 5, from kindergarten all the way through high school. The roads were so bad on the Navajo Reservation, kids could not go back and forth to school. So the government made sure that they stayed in boarding schools. The early boarding schools, they were not allowed to speak their language. Their hair was cut. They had to dress in Anglo clothing. They could not practice any of their traditional customs. And you ended up with a whole lot of Indian children that were pretty shell-shocked that eventually, when they went back to their tribe, did not fit in Anglo society and did not any longer fit in their own Native American societies. So there was a lot of psychological trauma going on with this. We were not the only ones to practice this. Australians did the same thing. They took Aborigine children and forcibly removed them from their families and took them a long way away and put them in schools with a lot of the same results. The Australian government has apologized for this, for the boarding schools. As far as I know, the American government has not yet. And the last couple of slides there are Foxwood. You see this very large building, slides 25 and 26. I wanted to show you what happens with the Native Americans today. Foxwoods is this enormous casino that is about an hour from New York City. And it's a very interesting indication of Native Americans today. Native Americans can build casinos. We cannot. But they have the right on their reservations to build casinos. Outside of New York, the Mashapequot tribe was almost wiped out, but there were a handful, maybe several dozen survivors in the early 1900s that held on to a very small reservation of about 200 acres. They had repeated offers to buy their land, and the two little old ladies that held title to the land refused to sell. They said, "We will never sell our land." Lucky for them, they held on to it. The tribe decided about 20 years ago to build a casino. Of course, they had outside investment, but they built a huge casino complex an hour out of New York City. They make tens of millions of dollars profit a year. The first thing they did with the money, of course, is help their own people. The other thing they did is built that enormous museum. The tall building is the casino. The next slide is a Native American museum, which I think is one of the best in the country. They built it in the shape of a traditional longhouse. They had millions of dollars to invest. They have all kinds of multimedia presentations. They have all kinds of artifacts. It's an incredibly good museum. I was the only person in it. Everybody else was across the highway in the casino. So if you're ever in the coast of Connecticut, check out Foxwoods. Check out the museum as well as the casino. So a number of Indian tribes are doing very well, and we're going to discuss that in our session this week. Thank you very much. Please take care out there.